Hey everybody, we just wanted to quickly jump in here and let you know about an awesome project that we have coming up that you can participate in. In September 2026, Matthias and I are going to be giving a battlefield tour in Berlin, looking at the fighting that took place there at the end of the Second World War in 1945. And of course, we're excited. We think it's going to be awesome, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So Matthias, why don't you give us a little sneak peek? What are we going to do?
Well, as you said, Jesse, it's going to be absolutely brilliant. It's going to be fascinating, analyzing the battle, the sheer destruction, the fighting in the center of Berlin. We're going to be visiting all the key locations that you need to see, that you need to understand if you want to understand the fighting in Berlin in 1945, which of course also has implications for European politics then after 1945 all the way up to today. So, for example, we're going to be visiting and discussing the Soviet attack onto the Reichstag, starting at the Moltke Bridge, where the Soviets crossed the River Spree and then attack the Reichstag itself. We're going to see the Führer bunker, where Hitler was sitting and hiding and still dreaming of world domination until he decided to kill himself. We show you exactly the spot where he then was burned, and the Soviets found the remains after the battle. We're going to be looking at the Bendler Block, which was part of the German High Command. This is where Stauffenberg had his office. That's where they tried to overthrow the Nazis and Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, where he and other people were then shot that particular night, where you now have a museum dedicated to German resistance. We're going to be looking at the topography of Terror, which was the headquarters of the Gestapo. The remains, the foundations are still there. There's an exhibition. And we're also going to go to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp in the north of Berlin, to explore this particular nasty side of the Nazi regime as well. So it's going to be a full few days. It's super nerdy. It is for the real history enthusiasts, so like us and hopefully you, and we'll hope to see you all there.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Once again, the battlefield tour of Berlin is going to be September 9th to 13th, 2026. If you're interested in finding out more, go to battleguide.co.uk, and hopefully we'll see you there.
In today's episode, we return to the Battle of the Bulge and take up the action with the first chaotic days of the German offensive, when no one was sure how things would turn out.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. So we're returning, as I just said, to the Ardennes forest, and have a more detailed and in-depth look at the Battle of the Bulge. So we talked about it last time in the previous episode. We set the strategic context. So where are we at the moment? What did we talk about last time?
Right, so we're on the edge of the start of the Battle of the Bulge in mid-December 1944. And essentially, to bring things together here to get us rolling for today, in late 1944, the Germans are in an awful strategic position, and Hitler essentially decides on a last gamble. Is that last gamble going to be in the east? No, because the impact is probably going to be less no matter what the Germans can do. That last gamble is going to be in the west. They're going to scrape together as many of the armored divisions as they can. They're going to try to punch through the American lines in the forested Ardennes region, just like they did to the French in 1940. And then turn north once they get through the forest and across the Meuse River, or Maas River in German, and reach the Channel at Belgian port town called Antwerp. And if they can do that, the Germans, they will have cut off a huge chunk of American, British, and Canadian forces in the Netherlands primarily, and they hope, that they can then force the Western allies to accept a compromise peace and then turn their remaining forces to defend Germany from the imminent Soviet offensives on the eastern border. That is essentially why they decide to attack in the Ardennes at the Battle of the Bulge, and then more or less the basic version of the plan. If you want more details, you can all, listeners and viewers, check out our previous episode where we go through the strategic situation and the planning in a little more depth. But essentially, that's where we are at on December 16th when the offensive is about to begin. But of course, Matthias, we've got to get a handle on who's going to be carrying out this offensive.
Absolutely. And I'm going to start with the Germans and what they're doing and the forces that they've put together and how they intend to use this and how all this is organized and structured. In the previous episode, we talked about the problems that the Germans are having, say, not enough petrol. They are beginning to run out of material, even though that is not the biggest problem for the Germans in late 1944. They still have tanks, they still have planes. The bigger problem is the petrol, and there's also the lack of trained crews. And that is really going to show later on in this particular campaign. When we look at the forces overall, on the 16th of December 1944, this is when the Ardennen Offensive, as the Germans call it, is launched. You're looking at, roughly speaking, just over 400,000 German soldiers. You're looking at around 550 tanks. So the numbers always go up and down a bit. Which ones are really there? Which ones can be used on the day? Which ones have to be serviced? So one of the figures you get is 557, for example. That's very, very, very precise. You also have around 660 self-propelled anti-tank guns. That in itself is quite interesting, because at this stage, the Germans are producing far more of the self-propelled anti-tank guns than tanks. And this is beginning to show here, just because they're much easier to produce, they're much cheaper to produce, because you don't have a turret that you have to put on top. That makes this you might call it a tank destroyer much, much lower, so the profile is much lower. The problem, of course, is you have to use the entire tank to aim at the enemy. We could go on about this, but I think that's probably a special episode on tanks and tank designs, so I'll park it at that.
Are they even tanks?
They're not tanks.
I'll throw that out there.
They're not tanks.
Huge debate about it.
Well, and in the German case, they're not tanks either. I can tell you this, artilleryman. So these self-propelled anti-tank guns are part of the artillery. So in the Second World War, these guys would wear uniforms that were the normal field grey, so normal army uniform, with the colors that we wear of the artillery, so that's red, but the cut and the design was of the tank units. As you said, huge debate. Here's the first tangent and rabbit hole of the day, dear listeners and viewers. Here we go. Big debate. Why is that? Some people have said because the tank people, Guderian, they didn't want these because they say, no, they're taking away the emphasis from the proper tanks. After the war, German generals said, well, very, very simple. We didn't have enough tank crews to put them in there. So we had to use someone else. And the obvious choice is then self-propelled guns, which the Germans also called not only self-propelled guns, but Sturmartillerie, so storm attack artillery. That's the official term. Gives it away. I could go on, but I think that's enough on that particular tangent, because we haven't even talked about anything here, to be perfectly honest. In addition to that, you have then artillery and all this, that's there as well. And how is all this then structured? So the Germans have, in the area where they want to attack, they've got 3 armies. And I'm going now from north to south, just talking you through it, and what the composition of these forces is. So the one in the north, which is supposed to be the main effort of this particular operation, so that's the Schwerpunkt, as the Germans would call it, that's the army that is supposed to reach Antwerp. We talked about Antwerp as the aim of this particular operation. And this is the 6th Panzer Army, consisting of 2 corps. And this army comes under the SS General Dietrich. He is quite famous. He is one of Hitler's most favorite generals, particularly at this stage of the war. We've had the 20th of July. Hitler doesn't trust the army anymore, so he puts all his trust in the SS. Dietrich, well, you can do an episode on him. Interesting character, in some ways fascinating. not well trained. He never went to an officer academy. So he's an over-promoted NCO. That's what he is. And the way he fights reflects this. I mean, let's park it there because otherwise that's going to take us far too far into Dietrich and his life story. But that's an interesting story. This particular army, I need to look at my notes so I don't get this wrong, has got a number of infantry divisions. So 1 to 3 infantry divisions, 1 Fallschirmjäger division, so paratroopers. It also has 2 SS Panzer divisions. And all of this is quite interesting. I'm going to spend 1 or 2 minutes now on this. I can keep it shorter for the other armies. So the infantry divisions that are being used are called Volksgrenadier Division, so People's Grenadier Division. This is a relatively new invention at that time. It's basically a reflection of the problems Germany is facing. Basically, Germany is running out of manpower. Whereas a normal infantry division, you need to look at what year, what date you're in, between 18 and 15,000 men, roughly speaking. A Volksgrenadier division has, as per order of battle, about 10,000. So it's much, much smaller. The idea is it should have more weapons, more machine guns, more submachine guns, all these things. That's the theory. So firepower is more important than manpower. That's the theory. In reality, it doesn't really work. So most of these are under strength and the equipment is not as good as you would have hoped. The term is interesting as well. Volksgrenadier, that's an invention of 1944. Grenadier means they're elite troops. That's elite infantry as per definition. Again, is that the case? Yes or no? Propaganda term. And the term Volk is very interesting. So it's the People's Grenadier Division. Why do they call it People's? Because they're all people anyway. Again, there's a propaganda aspect to this. So this idea of the people rising up, getting together, fighting against the enemy. That's a term everyone was familiar with. People even today sometimes are familiar with this. There's a famous speech by Goebbels where he kind of tries to rally the troops. It's all to do with the establishment of the Volkssturm, again, this militia. And he uses the term, nun Volk steh auf und Sturm bricht los. So people rise and, storm break loose. It's a very famous phrase. It actually comes from the 19th century, from a poem by a very famous German poet, Theodor Körner. So that was the time of the wars of liberation against the French. So today that doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't ring a bell. It did in 1944, 1945. You don't have this.
Just if I may, just for our non-German speaking audience, in case there's any confusion, the Volkssturm is not the same as Volksgrenadier, right? Just in case, they both start with Volk, but Volkssturm is the sort of over 45 crowd militia with a few teenagers thrown in.
Yeah.
And then the Volksgrenadier, as Matthias just explained, is a new type of infantry unit formation in the military.
No, you're absolutely right. Sometimes
in case.
You just get carried away because when you use these terms on a daily basis, it's easy to forget that you might have to explain these things. You're absolutely right. You then have a Fallschirmjäger division, so that's paratroopers. They, of course, seem to be an elite force. They haven't really jumped into action really since 1941, the Battle of Crete. But so they're used as an elite infantry formation. That's the theory. Again, the troops that you've got here, that's no longer the paratroopers of 1941. The training is not as good, the equipment, all these things, again, that we're looking at when we look at the German army at that time. There is the last time really that the German paras jump into action is during the Battle of the Bulge. We can look at this later. And then you've got these SS divisions. So 2 of the elite SS tank division. So that's the 12th, that's the Hitler Youth. And you've got the 1st, that is Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. So these are supposed to be the absolute elite formation of the Waffen-SS. And that is the spearhead. And you can see why this sheer force and this elitism, you might say, is concentrated in this particular army because they're supposed to drive all the way to Antwerp and seize this. If we go further down, you've now got the 5th Army under a general called von Manteuffel, a very experienced German general. And he's got 3 corps, and the composition is relatively similar. So you've got in 66 Corps, you've got 2 Volksgrenadier divisions. So that's an infantry corps. You've 48th Corps, which has got one tank division and a Volksgrenadier division, and the same applies to another corps, which is the 47th under a chap called von Lüttwitz, which has one tank division, a Volksgrenadier division, and also the Panzerlehr division, which again is supposed to be the army's elite tank formation. So that's basic composition of these, and the task of these guys is not to get all the way to Antwerp, but they're supposed to seize Brussels. So you might say it's a bit of flank protection to the southwest, the left flank of the main operation. And then further to the south, you've got another army, and we've got 6th, we've got 5th. You expect to have 4th army now. Of course you don't, because this is now 7th army, because otherwise it would be too easy. And that is under a general called Brandenberger, who is not the most famous of German generals of the Second World War, but also a very, very experienced one. And he's got in his 2 corps 1 Fallschirmjäger division and 3 of these Volksgrenadier divisions. So this is a pure infantry army, you might say, no armored support. And again, the idea is to give, so to speak, flank protection to the flank protection. So he is supposed to protect the southern flank. You also have an army further to the north of all of this, which is supposed to potentially play a role if the offensive goes really well and the enemy forces they are facing as well are being fixed by them and are being defeated. They can also launch a small attack as well. In reality, that does not really happen. So we've got these 3 main armies here that are set and ready to attack the American forces in the area there. And as we now said a number of times, drive all the way to Antwerp and, as they hope, turn the tide and win the war.
As they hope.
As they hope, exactly. As they hope. Yeah. As they hope.
But we can see here when we think about the composition of forces, the order of battle, we can see more weaknesses from the German point of view. Not only do they have understrength divisions for the most part, and the Volksgrenadier divisions are not what they were supposed to be, envisioned to be. But for example, if we think about 7th Army, they are a key to this whole thing. They're protecting the southern shoulder when everyone else is supposed to be moving further along. And that's probably where an Allied counterattack is going to come from. Because the American Third Army under General Patton, George Patton, is the army that would be in a position potentially to launch a counterattack from the south towards the north to maybe cut off the German penetration. And you have your weakest forces there that are not motorized, that don't have many trucks, that don't have any tanks. It's a gamble. It's an extreme gamble to do that. You say, well, you've got a larger, better equipped enemy formation that's south of us with an aggressive commander, and we don't have any tanks and we have hardly any mobility in our forces that are supposed to protect against them. Not only that, but this is something I probably should have mentioned in the last episode, but hey, what are you going to do? It's spontaneous, folks. The plans are somewhat vague. Like, what's going to happen after they take Antwerp, potentially? That is not clearly set out. So there's a bit of a lack of preparation for operations during this period of when they hope that the Allies will be realizing that they've lost. In any case, if we turn our attention now briefly to the Allied side of things, from the German point of view, potentially doomed forces in the north are essentially the Allied 21st Army Group, which is under Montgomery, which contains, for example, the British Second Army, the Canadian First Army, and some other formations. There are Poles there and some others. And facing the area where the main German attack is going to go in are parts of 2 US armies, parts of the First Army, basically the 5th Corps, and then the northern wing of the Third Army under Patton, which is the 8th Corps. So if the German plan goes well for them, you're going to have a chunk of US First Army that then also gets cut off in this big pocket with the Brits and Canadians. One of the issues that the Americans have is, despite their numerical advantage overall, they are stretched thin for what they're trying to do. They've been involved in some very costly sort of grinding fighting along their sector of the front in late 1944. There's the Hürtgen Forest, sucks up all sorts of resources. But they're also trying to prepare for a joint offensive that's supposed to come in early 1945. And that will become what's called Operation Veritable, that starts in February. But initially, the idea is they don't know the Germans are going to attack at the Bulge, so they are conducting operations themselves to prepare for their own future offensive. And that weakens their sector in the Ardennes because they're moving troops to try to capture a couple of important dams a little bit further to the southeast. Dams over a small river called the Ruhr. Confusingly, it sounds the same as the industrial region, but it's not. It's a tiny river. It's also spelled differently in any case. So they're trying to capture these dams. And that means that they've spread their troops thin in the Ardennes, as the French did in 1940. Ironically, they only have something like 80,000 men facing that initial onslaught. So if you think up to 400,000 Germans versus 80,000 Americans in the initial phase of the offensive, that's not good from the defending point of view. To make the American situation more complicated, they are still adjusting to the new character of the fighting, the new type of fighting that has started in the fall. So you organize your army a certain way when you're expecting to defeat the enemy and then pursue them, right? You're going to have lighter units, you're going to have mobile units that are meant to chase the enemy once you've broken their strength with others. And one of these types of lighter units that the Americans have for the summer of 1944, they're called cavalry groups. And they are lighter. They're not made for defending. They're not made for a grinding type of warfare. They're made for pursuit. And so when you have quite a few of those units in this area, pound for pound, they're less good at defending because that's not what they're equipped or trained to do. So this is the kind of fragile combination on the American side that exists facing these three German armies. On the other hand, of course, they have an enormous air force and an enormous tactical air force that can be ready at a moment's notice to try to stop the German offensive, but that will depend on the weather, naturally. What they also have, and this will play a role, is lots of reserves elsewhere that even though they're being used or they're stationed elsewhere, they have that mobility. They have tens of thousands of trucks that at a moment's notice can rush tens of thousands of men in any direction. And that's kind of a bit of a joker card that they can play if need be. And need will be. Let's just put it that way. Once the attack begins. So, Matthias, is there anything else that we need to cover before we get into the action here?
No, I think that sums up quite nicely. And again, everything you just explained shows, first of all, the desperation, I would say, on the German side, and also the need for speed that the Germans have. So they really need to be quick in this operation, because the moment the Allies are able to bring in all these 10,000 of trucks and all the material that they have and can move troops around on the battlefield, then the Germans are on the back foot. So everything needs to happen very, very quickly. Now, again, think about the terrain, think about the bad weather. As we said, the Germans are choosing the bad weather period because that means that they don't have Allied air force over their heads. So all that, again, immediately puts the Germans on the back foot. So it's all about maneuverability, it's all about speed, and that really is a huge problem. The Germans are still thinking that when it comes to the actual fighting, particularly the tactical level and also the operation level, they are better than the Western allies. So they think they're able to make decisions more quickly, to outmaneuver and outthink the enemy, because they see themselves as a more battle-hardened army, experience of warfare, particularly also on the Eastern Front. So they think this is the trump card that they've got. But as we'll see when this battle unfolds, well, things are not going particularly well for the Germans right from the start. So let's start at the beginning first of all, and also, of course, in the center of gravity. So this is the Sixth Army, which is supposed to punch through the enemy lines and make their way to Antwerp as quickly as possible. So the spearhead, you might say, of this, I didn't mention them earlier because they're part of the normal orbit. That's Kampfgruppe Peiper, Joachim Peiper. Very famous man, mainly becomes famous or perhaps infamous because of the Malmedy massacre. We can talk about this later because that plays a role here, and that's exactly where it happens. But maybe we park this for a moment and return to this because let's concentrate on the operational and tactical bits before we talk about war crimes during this particular operation. So S-Man, so he with his Tigers, well, basically Tiger 2, so that really is the spearhead. That's what the Germans have got. That's the best stuff. But they are also very thirsty. We talked about this earlier. So they are really relying on being able to find these petrol dumps somewhere once they've broken through the enemy lines. There's another interesting formation that is Skorzeny. That's basically a tank brigade. We can return to him later as well. So they attack in this area and in the north, and it's interesting. So you've got the spearhead, you've got the most experienced troops, you've got the best equipped ones, the most indoctrinated troops, all these SS troops. So this is really supposed to be the great success. And right from the beginning, it goes quite badly. And the main reason for that is that the American formations that are in the way of this Kampfgruppe and the German troops attacking here, that's mainly the 2nd and the 99th US Infantry Divisions. They put up a very, very strong resistance. And they are really beginning to slow down and hold the Germans right from the beginning. So the Germans are supposed to reach a certain point, a key road that they wanted to use through a place called the Losheim Gap. That's the name of it. That's what they had to seize in order to be able to push through. That is defended. It's also blocked because you have collapsed overpasses that fell down onto it. So the German engineers are not quick enough to clear all of this. So the Germans, right from the beginning, have to divert their troops, which of course is costing time. And that is the one thing that the Germans don't really have. They then decide to divert the route. They go through a place called Lanzerath. That's the name of the place. And they look at this, and it's a build-up area. The last thing you want to do is send your armor into a build-up area when you know the enemy forces are in there. So they push in troops from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment to clear the village. That, again, takes much, much longer than expected. The casualties on the German side are really, really quite high. So it is said that an American reconnaissance, basically it's a platoon, 18 people roughly speaking, from the 99th Division, is able to hold this German attack off somewhere in the region of 500 men all the way during the morning. So the Germans attack in the morning all the way to about 1600. So that is very, very late. And they're causing, again, the sources are a bit debated, but around 90 casualties on the German side. I mean, that tells you quite a lot about it. First of all, about the willingness and the ability of the Allied forces to fight. We talked about this, the Germans constantly underestimating this. It also tells you quite a bit about the quality of the German troops. As I said earlier, these are no longer the elite forces, the extremely well-trained, particularly well-equipped and extremely superbly led and commanded troops. So this is very different. They still have all these names. So this is a Fallschirmjäger division. They're supposed to be an absolute elite formation. If you got 500 people held by 18 men, suffering about 90 casualties, that tells you quite a bit. So that these are all problems, and this fight there then creates a bit of a bottleneck, and they have to clear this before Peiper can actually set off. And so he sets off at around 1600 hours, so quite late. That is, basically they've lost a whole day, you might say. They were supposed to launch the attack very, very early in the morning, and they don't reach their first objective, which the station is called Brockholt Station, which they were supposed to seize quite early on the first day. They only get there on the 17th. So they basically lost, you might say, the first day, and so it's not going well at all. And this is only going to get worse. So I could ramble through it now, but I think I'm going to throw it back to you because otherwise I'm on scent again the whole time, talking you through tactical actions. So where do we go from there?
Well, I think in the north, one of the other things that's significant about the initial delays is, as you said, they can't capture these initial objectives quickly enough. One of the early objectives is also a piece of high ground called the Elsenborn Ridge, which the Germans also struggle, also can't take on schedule. And what ends up happening is sometimes what you think is going to be a feature of geography or time or something else that you can exploit turns against you if things don't go your way. And the fact that the Ardennes region is so thickly forested, of course, the Germans think, well, this is an advantage. We're going to be harder to hit with air power. We have more cover. There'll be fewer enemy troops. Maybe the enemy doesn't expect us there. Okay, that's all fine if it's 1940 and there's one weak French infantry division on the other side of the Ardennes for you to slice through. But that's not the case anymore. And so what ends up happening is there's a kind of cascade effect when you struggle to keep your very ambitious time schedule. That thick forest becomes your enemy because the roads are very narrow and windy and hilly. So you get traffic jams, which is not what you want to have, especially when the enemy potentially has air superiority, even though on the first day the weather's bad, so the Allied air forces are quite limited. Then what happens? You're already operating in a kind of desperation situation, and your political leadership just doesn't take no for an answer, and that could put you in a bad situation if you're a commander who doesn't perform even to unrealistic expectations. So you make hasty adjustments that you might otherwise not make. So German commanders start sending in reserves to help to capture those stubborn American positions, but that makes the traffic jam worse. So you end up having this like cascade effect that ends up turning what the Germans hoped would be an advantage in attacking in this difficult terrain to kind of as much of a disadvantage for them as it is for the other side. And that, I think, is one of the interesting, I guess, observations we can make about the very early stages. The other one is on the Allied side, because, of course, they don't know exactly what's going on. They've got the fog of war blinkering them, and they have to interpret, what's happening here. Is this something big? Is this something small? Is this something in between? We sitting here, or you folks sitting at home having read a book or even the Wikipedia article about the Battle of the Bulge, know from the start that it's a big thing, that it's meant to be a strategic gamble and lots of units and formations. But Allied command is still unsure in the first hours, how serious is this? Do we have to send in reserves and reinforcements, or can sort of local commanders handle this? And I think that natural hesitation, because that's always going to be an issue, gauging the enemy intentions, that natural hesitation makes the fierce resistance of those US frontline units even more critical and even more valuable for the ultimate, successful Allied outcome. And all this on the first day.
All this on the first day, absolutely. And in many ways, the first day already sums up, first of all, what's going to happen in the battle, but also sums up quite a few other things. We talked about different ways of fighting quite a bit, how the Germans fight, how the Western Allies fight. And this is embodied here as well, at least in theory. It doesn't really work particularly well on the German side for all the reasons we already mentioned. So they are slowed down, the quality isn't there anymore. But once they actually have managed to seize the very first objectives, and they then get to other places, like there, for example, there's a place called Honsfeld where Piper gets into then on the evening of that day. And there they encounter, basically it's a rear area, rest area of the 99th Division. And you've got a lot of very confused troops. They're all clocked up. They're trying to get out or get somewhere. No one knows what's going on. No proper orders being given. So they managed to knock out a number of vehicles. They take quite a few prisoners. They also managed to seize one of these petrol dumps. Some people say up to 190,000 liters of petrol. I'm not quite sure if that is true. That's a lot. But again, these metal beasts are very thirsty, so it sounds more impressive than it really is. But here you can see, well, this is what the German army wants to do. This is how the German army wins its battles and engagements in the Second World War. It's not really about killing everybody. That's not the aim at all. It's about confusing them. It's about breaking the will to fight. And after the very, very sketchy start, so you can see, at least on the German side, you know what, maybe it is working. So look at this, we've done it now. It looks as if we've kind of broken through somewhere. The Americans are confused, there's panic. So this is actually beginning to look reasonably good and well for the Germans. Of course, as we know, in the end, it's not. And quite quickly, also Piper runs into the next problem. But it just sums up all these different ideas of how you fight and what you can do. And you got the same on the American side. I think you're absolutely right. The last thing you want to do as a senior commander is to launch reserves, launch a counterattack too early. This is always the tricky bit when we look at how war is being fought. Very often we concentrate on the pure tactical level. So here's someone sitting in the foxhole, staring at these German tanks rolling towards him, because it makes great stories in books and it makes great films. And of course, it's the human element. Well, let's face it, this is the level where people fight, and that also means this is where people die. So that's important for the individuals, for the units. If you then take a step back and adopt what I always call the cold-eyed staff officer approach, you have to wait and see how the situation develops and evolves. And only once you've identified where the enemy's point of main effort is, then you launch your counterattack. So it all makes kind of sense. It's not to say that the Americans weren't surprised by this. Maybe in inverted commas, it doesn't really matter that much because, as we already said, and you explained so well, they've got all this material, so they can bring things there, even if it takes a little bit longer. As long as the Germans don't achieve their operation, that strategic objectives very early on, it's pretty obvious where this battle is going to go. So that's a very, very important factor. We tend to overlook this, particularly quite often when we look at the operational level of war, because the operational level of war is difficult. When you read books, when you see films, you will normally see two levels. It's either the tactical bit where the fighting actually happens, or you see the great strategy. You see Hitler in the bunker. You see Eisenhower talking about whatever. You hardly ever see things in between where you have the strategic and the tactical coming together. And there are a number of reasons for that. It's difficult to portray that in books and films. It's also, for viewers and readers, it can be, in inverted commas, a little bit boring because there's a lot of staff work involved. You don't really talk about explosions. You don't talk about Hitler doing this, Hitler doing that. It's the staff officer sitting down, coming up with their plans, which if you're a geek like me and have done the military training, you find that absolutely exciting. And I nearly said it's great fun to do these things, but putting these plans together is really, really interesting. But you need to have the eye for this, and also, and that's the important bit, you need to have the understanding. And that is both for the people who are reading the books, watching the films, but also the people writing them. And quite often that expertise is missing. And that's why we concentrate very much at the other levels. So that was just my operational burst here. There we go.
I mean, I'm not a Hollywood filmmaker, but I can imagine that if we pitched a studio on a movie where you have a bunch of staff officers sitting around their headquarters talking about maps and fuel requirements and bridging equipment and so on, it's not going to go anywhere.
Nah, it's not.
Right?
It's not sexy.
So
it's a bit like logistics. It's not sexy. Logistics isn't. Logisticians out there, forgive me, but as we all know, logistics is not sexy. Logistics is something that just happens. It's just there. So that's of course. Of course, to redeem myself. From
Napoleon's point of view, yes, but
to redeem myself, I could also. I think it was Rommel, wasn't it? Who said, "Logistics isn't everything, but without logistics, everything else is nothing." So hopefully, logisticians out there, I'm forgiven.
A rare German who appreciates logistics and their importance. Let's say
it's overrated. It's overrated.
Yeah. So it's worth, by the way, pointing out. I think when we're talking about the Allies trying to judge things, that by the end of the first day, December 16th, they are still tending to think that this is a limited German operation. They have not really grasped the full importance because they have a very limited amount of information available to them. However, to get us back fully on track here and to properly, I think, wrap up this episode and set the stage for the rest of the operation in the next episode, we have talked about that northern German army, the 6th SS Panzer Army, and the trouble that they had and the traffic jams. But we haven't yet sort of wrapped up the story of the initial attacks in the center and the south. So I would throw that over to you, Matthias, to kind of guide us through that a little bit.
Well, before we go there, because you just triggered a thought, it's not a proper tangent. It's actually related to what we're talking about, which is highly unusual.
Indeed.
But because you talked about information, I think that's absolutely vital here. So the Allies at this particular stage are beginning to have a bit of an information, and that means intelligence problem. So intelligence, of course, is information that you analyze and then do whatever with it and turn that into intelligence. Up to this stage, they could rely on a number of different sources. The first one, of course, at the very high level was Ultra. That gave them a lot of information. They can still use that, but much less of it, because the Germans are now using far less of these radio messages. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, there's secrecy anyway, because you're putting together an offensive operation. You also have a number of these German troops stationed back in Germany or close to the German border before this operation. That means quite often they don't have to rely on radio, which can be listened in by the enemy. But for example, they can use the existing radio telephone network, and they just ring people. And they're now also going back to the tested and tried German way of doing things, and that sometimes just means some notes and letters being sent from one headquarters to the other. So that's the first problem that they have. The second problem, of course, is that you're now looking at the German army, which is fighting close to the German border, which is stationed within Germany to a degree at least. So you can't rely on, for example, a resistance network anymore that you had in France, and they would give information. That's dried up. That doesn't exist anymore. And that's why the Allies are having problems putting together the right sort of picture. And
and the weather, of course.
And
the weather
yeah,
limits the aerial reconnaissance.
Exactly.
You can't fly over the forest and be like, oh, there's a column there and a column there, right?
Exactly. You've got that absolutely right. And the Allies also know through the information they've got, the intelligence, all this, that they know the Germans are up to something. But they, as you already said, they're thinking that the Germans went for the plan that was brought forward by Rundstedt as the commander in the West, or Model, who is the commander of the Army Group B, who's responsible for the overall offensive here, who had argued for a much, much smaller operation. So they think, well, this is probably what's going to happen. Probably we don't have to worry too much about this. What's the strategic aim? What's the objective here? There isn't really any. We might just have to withdraw, and then we build up our reserves. And when the weather gets better, we can just smash up the Germans, to use that very good but very unofficial mission verb. And then we basically just go from there. So from an Allied point of view, it also makes sense. Yes, they were surprised, but there are some reasons why they were surprised. Again, you've got terrain as well. You talked about this, a bit like 1940, where no one expected that something would happen in this particular. So all these things are coming together. Perhaps just very briefly, I'm just summing this up now, and we can go in more detail perhaps in the next episode again in the north. So we just talked about this. So you've got this the real spearhead here, so the iron fist, you might say, of this attack, and that is delayed. It's stopped by the Americans relatively on. There are a number of successes in the later stages of the first day as well. But everything is much, much slower than hoped and expected. And quite early on, the Germans get very frustrated, including Hitler, who can't understand what's going on. So this is where they should be pushing through. This is not working. With a very, very broad brush, what's happening in the other areas. So the advance is basically, you might say, halted in the north. In the center, for some strange reason, the attack is far more successful. This is really where the Germans are beginning to push through. The American resistance is far less organized. In the north, what you have is, the moment you have a built-up area, very broad brush now because I don't want to go to all the tactical details, you have the defensive position established by the Americans, and that slows them down, the Germans. In the south, they are much more effective in clearing these and bypassing them, and the advance in the center is faster and further than actually expected. And that is interesting because now the emphasis could switch or not. So this is always one of these very important decisions. What do you do? Do you reinforce success, or do you stick with the original plan? There are a number of examples in warfare where similar things like this had happened. A very famous one is the German Michael offensive of 1918, which way basically pretty much the similar situation. So where you got the main thrust, it slowed down. in another area, the attack is far more successful. So the Germans look at it and say, what are we going to do here now? Because they know that if they're going to reinforce the push in the center, they will have to not abandon, but weaken the push in the north. That means they're probably not going to get to Antwerp. It also means they're going to lose time because you need to regroup. Regrouping takes time. So these are decisions that are now being mulled over in the early days and early hours of this particular offensive. The southern sector, we go to the army that we've got down there. They launch attack as well. It makes a little bit of progress, but if you just look at the composition of these forces, so this is, as we said, it's a pure infantry army. So this is not particularly quick. It's not particularly fast. It can't really outmaneuver an enemy. It can outwalk the enemy, but that is very, very difficult in a situation like this. So they are making progress. There's a bit of flank protection. But the success that the center has is now causing problems as well, because you're now creating not a gap yet, but potentially a gap between the army in the south and the one in the center. And as you explained earlier, and the Germans know this as well, this is now the gap that the Americans are beginning to see early on as well. Once they're able to bring up these troops with these, as you mentioned, as you said, the 10,000 vehicles that they've got, they can move these up and attack into, you might call it the soft underbelly of the what's now becoming the main thrust of the German army. So all sorts of really interesting developments. The operational aim or the operational picture really shaped, as is often the case, by the tactical actions on the ground.
Yeah, this is actually another critique of the plan with hindsight, is that the northern main thrust is also against what was the strongest part of the American line in that sector. So, do you want to really have your main effort against the strongest part of the enemy defenses? Usually not. Usually you don't want to go that way. In any case, no, go ahead.
Well, the reason why they do this is, of course, it's logistical restrictions. So they know they have to get to Antwerp, the main objective, very, very quickly. And that means, to keep it very simple, you need to take the shortest route. It would make more sense to push to the center, outmaneuver the enemy, cut through the rear lines, encircle the troops there as well. While in the north, you just fix the enemy troops so they can't move out there. But that means more time, more petrol. More time also means looking at the weather forecast. When is the good weather coming back in, which is going to, as the Germans expect, completely smash up their offensive from the air. So again, it's a big gamble. And they're hoping that, as they think, because of their superior leadership skills, they think that they're still the better fighters. As we've seen, not necessarily the case. Even these elite troops here struggling, that they will be able to completely surprise the enemy forces and roll through. So another gamble within this huge gamble that the Germans are trying to play out here.
I also think it's worth mentioning with the 7th Army in the south, they do make some progress, but they also have some difficulties. There are also some delays there. They need to cross 2 small rivers, the Our and the Sauer rivers, but they're short engineering equipment. They're short bridging equipment, right? So here again, we have these non-combat arms, be it, fuel supply trucks, or in this case, bridging equipment, that come back to hinder the Germans and make their job a lot more difficult. But to give credit where credit's due, the American artillery, I think, is a bit of one of the unsung heroes from the US, from the Allied point of view in this battle, because when your infantry is having a hard time, when your frontline positions are thinly manned, you are going to, and when your air force is mostly grounded, what do you have? What do you have to hold back the enemy, to break up enemy formations as they are approaching your lines, those vulnerable, weaker infantry positions? You've got artillery. And it's the US artillery that does a very effective job against the 7th Army, trying to slow them down, trying to inflict casualties. And they do slow them down. In fact, some of the 7th Army is not able to cross those rivers on schedule, partly because of the bridging problems and partly because it's difficult to get through the American artillery fire. So shout out to the US artillery. They play a big role in the Battle of the Bulge, not only on the first day. We'll mention them later on as well, or at least I have a note, so I should mention them later on as well.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's artillery in many ways is always the big battle winner for the Allies on the whole on the Western Front. This is something that is also recognized by the Germans throughout the war. So we talked a lot about, well, the Germans not holding the enemy infantry and armor in very high regard because of leadership and training and all these things that we've talked about. But the one thing that right from the beginning of the war all the way to the end, the Germans are really, you might say, afraid of is the Western Allies artillery. First of all, because there's a lot of firepower. And also because these guys are very, very good. And it boils down to simple things like having very good maps. You need very good maps when you're an artilleryman. And the maps of the Western Allies are extremely good. The British maps are sometimes even slightly better than the American maps. The Americans quite often use British maps. And they're absolutely superb. So all the after-action reports from the Germans always really do praise the indirect fire support that the Allies get from their artillery. So, yeah. And so I'm always being criticized for being too critical of the Western Allies. So now I'm not. I'm actually praising the Allied forces. There we are. No, they're doing a really good job. And as I said, that's something the Germans always mention.
And of course, you happen to coincidentally praise their artillery.
Isn't that
being
strange?
an artilleryman
Isn't that
yourself.
strange?
just a random coincidence. And on that note, folks, we will, I think, wrap up today's episode on the Battle of the Bulge. It won't be the last one. We'll have one more episode, I think, where we follow the offensive to its conclusion and then have a little think about what it meant, why it failed, and that sort of thing. For today, we essentially have taken you through day one, pretty much, of who's doing the fighting, what happens on the ground, where we have the Germans held up in the north. That's their main arm, is held up. Better than expected success in the center, and then a mixed result in the south. But all the while, of course, the sword of Damocles of a big US counterattack from the south is hanging over their heads. And we'll get into that in the next episode. So, if you liked what you heard or watched today, folks, we would like to invite you to become a supporter of our podcast. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com. If you want to become a supporter of the podcast, you get a bit of a bonus from us. You get access to exclusive content in our war room, content that's not available in the wider general public. A recent piece we did, for example, was Matthias and I talked about a couple of our favorite World War II books. If you're looking to extend your reading list and put yourself into debt by compulsively buying books, as I do, then that might give you a couple of hints. In any case, you can get a free trial of access to the War Room by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see you in the War Room, but regardless, we will, of course, see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.